While Pilsners are brewed in most countries around the globe, there's one town in Bohemia that can claim to be the birthplace of that particular style. That was the reason I took a small detour from Saaz to Pilsen, a majestic city with an impressive beer history. Like in many other medieval towns, the burghers of Pilsen, those rich people who owned a building made of stone inside the city walls, enjoyed brewing privileges. These privileges more or less meant you could brew beer in your house and you could sell it inside the city and about a mile around the city. No one else was allowed to do that. So these privileges made burghers, the patricians, very rich. They had their brewing privileges, but their beer quality sort of decreased after several years. In the early 19th century, beer from Pilsen was considered not to be very good, and in 1838 it was decided that they would stop brewing in these small house breweries altogether and build a state-of-the-art brewery. Well, this state-of-the-art brewery made Pilsner beer world famous. In 1842, the burghers of Pilsen had constructed the Bürgerliches Brauhaus Pilsen, that brewery that we see right behind me. And they commissioned a brewmaster from Bavaria, Josef Groll, and he was commissioned to brew a dark beer, Bavarian-style beer, which was dark at the time. But he knew better. He brewed the first modern Pilsner-style beer. When Josef Groll came to Pilsen in 1842, he found one of the most modern breweries on earth. And that was the modern brew kettle. It was a square brew kettle, quite different from what we are using today. But he had the right ingredients. He had the soft water from Pilsen, he had the Saaz hops, and he had the palest malt that could be found in Europe at the time. Combined with a bottom-fermenting yeast, this resulted in the beer that we now know as Pilsner beer. One key ingredient in modern beers, in all bottom-fermenting beers, is the bottom-fermenting yeast. Josef Groll brought some bottom-fermenting yeast from Bavaria, and it's actually the same yeast strain that has later been isolated and kept in the brewery ever since and is used in production till today. Lager beer, and all Pilsens are lager beers, beers that are matured for a long time. Actually, they were matured in old wooden barrels, and they still do it just to demonstrate how beer was made in the old days. In fact, you wanted to have clear beer, and lagering means you store the beer till it gets clear. Well, this beer that we're here getting at the so-called pipa, well, it's very hazy, it's still hazy. You were waiting till the beer would be clear because the yeast would settle at the bottom, and then you had a more or less clear beer. Nowadays you do filtration, but that was like the beer was looking like in the days of Josef Groll. Cheers to him. There's also some yeastiness to the aroma. It's a very full-bodied beer, and it's kind of different to the Pilsner beers, the filtered Pilsner beers that you actually know when you buy a Pilsner beer. Large-scale brewing made a real difference. Before the mid-19th century, there were many brewing towns with many small breweries. Each and every town had their different beers, but even in the small breweries, the beers were different. And even in the same brewery, you would find that the beer could be sweet in 1 week, bitter the next week, and maybe sour in the 3rd week. What industrial scale brewing meant was having constant product. And Pilsen was one of the towns that made a standard. It set the standard for a relatively pale lager. And these beers, of course, were copied because many brewers said, we want to have a standard quality. So brewers in Austria, in Germany, even in Scotland decided they wanted to brew their own Pilsner beer. Different versions for different countries. So not every beer that was called Pilsner had a lot to do with what we get here in Pilsen. Many of these beers were just pale lagers. But on the other hand, the Pilsner name spread through the world. And now we have very different styles of Pilsner beer. There's German-style Pilsners, there's Bohemian-style Pilsners, there's international-style Pilsners, all different. And still, there's one thing that they have in common. They're brewed with bottom-fermenting yeast, they're pale in color, and they're all beers that are very easy drinking. Lager beer brewing meant you had a standardized product. The use of bottom-fermenting yeast enabled brewer to brew a beer that would taste exactly the same from batch to batch. And when you had such an industrial product, you wanted to export it. Of course, you could only do that on a small scale at a time when there were no railway lines. First beers from Pilsen to Prague went on horse-drawn carriages. But then later on in the 1860s, railway lines were built. And so Pilsner beer made a huge success by being transported to all corners of the earth. And it was a success everywhere. First city that was reached was Prague. And of course there was a railway line from Pilsen to Prague and further on to Vienna. At that time there was one train loaded with Pilsner beer that went from Pilsen to Vienna each and every day.